Okay, so third show and tell. Thank you very much for joining us. This is what we're going to go through today. A bit of an intro and recap from me, and Sam will introduce the user research we've been doing. Saul will talk about the service governance arrangements we've put in place. Glenn will cover off some detail about the infrastructure and costs that we've designed around the new offer. Saul and Dan will talk about the prototypes that we've put together as part of this, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do in our last sprint, which is sprint 4. So hopefully get through that just under an hour, see how we get on. So a quick intro and recap. We three councils are working together harmoniously, beautiful harmony, with our lovely friends at DXW. And this is what we've been doing over the scope of the project. So our income management system, we started off by mapping the landscape and the wider ecosystem because we wanted to understand the scope of the project, essentially, and the scope of the product. So income management sits in the middle of a whole myriad of things. Some of those things we're concerned about, some of them we're not. So we wanted to go through that and just define where we were at. We knew from the discovery that there were some additional needs in the system that we have in Barnsley that we hadn't catered for, so things like ATP payments and face-to-face payments and a couple of other bits and pieces. So we've put some prototypes together around how those missing features would work when we introduce them. We have designed a first iteration of a support model and proposition. So essentially, this is what the IMS is, this is what it isn't, how can other councils get it, what support's available when they do. We did some work around personas to understand the different types of councils that would perhaps take it up. So some councils will be technically savvy, others won't, and we've got a sort of variance in the different types of councils that would want it. Put together a cost model for the future service, so if we can offer it out, what's it going to cost for councils that want to take it on? And around service governance, how do we manage it when we do make it available? And then finally around the infrastructure and the architecture, if we are going to make it available, we've got to run it somewhere, so what are the costs associated with that? And there are interdependencies between all these things. Obviously, the costs of running the thing then impact on the costs of councils buying it from us, and so on and so forth. All kinds of interdependencies there. So that's what we focused on in sprint 1. We mapped out the landscape. We started discussions about the prototypes. We didn't get into actually designing the prototypes during sprint 1. There was a lot of conversation to be had. We created those council personas so we knew who we were working for. And we started the conversations around the reference architecture and the infrastructure. During sprint 2, we did more work on the prototypes. We started to design the first iteration of the support model and the proposition. So we started to build that up, and we did a lot more around the architecture and infrastructure work. That architecture and infrastructure work is incredibly technical and in depth, so there's been a lot put into that. Sprint 3. We continued with the prototypes, we continued with the support model and proposition. We started on the service governance piece, and we continue with the architecture and infrastructure. And these are the things we're going to talk about today. So on the prototypes, Dan and Saul are going to talk us through those. With the support model and proposition, we put that together during sprint 2. We've tested it with councils now and done some user research around it. So Sam's going to talk to us about that. With the service governance, we've put together a proposal around that, which Saul will talk through, and around the reference architecture and the infrastructure, we've got to a point that we know what that's going to look like. We've based it on AWS, and we've got some costs attached to that, which Glenn will talk about. Okay, so over to Sam. Do you want me to control the slides, Sam, or are you taking over the screen?
Yes, that would be great if you can drive the slides.
No worries, go for it.
Thank you. So if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So over the last 2 sprints, we focused on creating a survey, and also we had a proposition feedback session yesterday. So the survey was in order to gather more information and to better understand the user needs. So we designed that survey. We wanted to understand their priorities for an IMS system, understanding what support may look like. So in regards to the survey, we had 20 responses in total. All the slides gone. Okay, there we are. And then we had 10 complete responses from council. So the survey was split into 2 journeys. We had a journey for the finance officers, procurement users, and also IT. In regards to the proposition sessions, the aim of this was to understand what the proposition should look like, whether we'd get a positive feedback from the proposition. So we wanted to understand, the benefits and costs associated with switching to a new IMS, and what are the triggers, the drivers, and the barriers to change. It's important to note also that we have a second proposition later this afternoon with another council, so we'll be adding on to the insights that we've already found. In terms of the attendees, we had 5 attendees from 3 different councils: district, city, and London Borough. In terms of their roles, again, it was a mix of finance and IT. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide. Thank you. Great. So one of the questions we asked in the survey was, what are your priorities when procuring an IMS system? The most top 3 important priorities for users came up as the security compliance, quality of support and service, as well as licensing, hosting and support costs. So with integration being the least important in regards to priorities, as you can see here, it was the least selected for. However, this was the route for the finance officers. So as we go forward, we will see that with the IT officers, integration costs was actually more important. And again, this could be in regards to their time savings. We know that councils want to configure their own import exports. However, it tends to be costly in terms of the time savings. Go to the next slide. So we asked the same question here around their priorities when it comes to procuring an IMS solution. What are the things that are most important to you? Now, as you can see here, we've got licensing costs, support costs, migration, security, a product that is updated and developed. So you can see here there's quite a lot that were extremely important and very important to users. One of the things that was actually interesting was that open source was actually marked moderately important to not at all important. So that was quite interesting to see. And in the session, we kind of digged into why that was. So it's important to note again that this was the route for the IT officer. So we can see that open source was least important. However, licensing, support and migration and securities was the most important. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we asked them, is there any other priorities that wasn't listed in the slides prior to? And some of this was easy accessible software upgrades that they'd like. They'd like the flexibility to add or amend interfaces, and basically a user-tailored approach, as well as being able to compile accurate data so that it's easy and simple to use, and the need to have ongoing development programs, which was proposed as a benefit in terms of the regulatory requirements. Thank you. So we were interested in understanding who actually sets the contract length for the income management system. Is it the supplier? Is it set by the supplier, or is it set by the council themselves? So the results suggest that the council often have control over how long they want the contract to be. The issue is that once it's set, it's often hard to leave these contracts, and they're quite tied in if they are not happy with the service. And we've heard from users from the proposition session that they are quite unhappy with the service that they've received. And major pain points being centered around restrictions and processes around making tweaks and changes to better suit their needs. We've also heard that councils set lengthy term contracts due to the costs and the processes, and also the effort in procuring. It actually can be time consuming. Thank you. So we asked, what is your current income management system contract length? And we can see here the majority tend to go for 4 years and plus. It tends to be the average length for IMS contracts. Again, this echoes the findings that that it's hard to move on from an existing supplier for a number of reasons, such as lack of choice, difficulty in ending contracts, and especially fear of the unknown. Thank you. So in regards to understanding what is the contract length influenced by, and some of the things that came out strongly were cost savings. So councils want to be able to save a lot of money when they are procuring for these IMS solutions. That seemed to be the biggest influencer, as well as the process and effort it takes to change an IMS. The ones that did choose a shorter contract, such as 1 or 2 years in the previous slides, were the ones that stated that they would rather have the flexibility in their requirements and would not rather be tied down to a software. So we're starting to see similar findings as we go through the survey results, and also in regards to the proposition sessions that we had. So this section is in regards to support. We wanted to understand who supports your income management system. A lot of the users mentioned that their software supplier is the one that offers the professional services and supports to them. However, mentioned that they would actually go through the internal team first for any issues. And this may be due to associated costs that may come with support through the supplier. So users would rather, deal with it in-house and see what they can do. And for the bigger costs or bigger changes, they would rather just go straight to the supplier. And as we go through these slides, we'll see the associated costs to doing that, and the particular things that are that councils are not able to do themselves, and they would rather just push to the supplier. Next slide, please. So this is a list of services that the support contract includes. So as you can see, some of these things are around upgrades, backing up the data, applying security patches and system upgrades, improvements and enhancements, custom changes. So almost all the services were included in the support contract, with adding and removing users, and also doing resets being the least known to the service in the user contract. Next slide. So these were insights from the propositions session in regards to support. So as you can see here, there were concerns from councils around suppliers not having enough staff to deal with all the requests and changes that needed to be made. When councils are going through transformational or system change, they need the request to be made as soon as possible, and that can be quite frustrating for users or councils when things are not done as soon as possible because they need that change. They mentioned that a lot of time is spent waiting for validation and changes, and especially when they are paying thousands of pounds for the service, you wouldn't expect them to be waiting that long. So that was a frustration that came out of the user research sessions. Next slide. So this is from the survey results. So we wanted to understand how much time does your finance team spend on integrations, changes, and upgrades. And this is in regards to coordinating and testing software upgrades, specifying, implementing custom changes, and manual workarounds. So as you can see here, the time varies between councils. This may be due to team size, team capability, and agreements that they may have with their supplier. So knowing this information should make a case for cost savings. And the problem with this is that we kind of wanted to dig into more granular data to understand what this data actually means. So going forward, we will see more information around the time and costs and the influence that it has. Next slide, please. So we wanted to understand what systems does your current IMS integrate with. Here we have the regular systems such as Oracle and Capita. Some of this includes Northgate, Zell's payroll, management service, payment management service, third-party payment chaos, leisure, schools, libraries. So these were quite interesting to understand the other internal systems that councils may have that they may need to integrate with going forward when we are proposing the IMS. Thank you. So we want to understand who is responsible for changes, integrations and enhancements. Is it the council or is it the supplier? So we had some mixed responses here. Some councils go straight to the supplier for changes and enhancements or configurations, and other councils would rather do it themselves first before going to the supplier. They would need the IMS supplier to help them to do additional changes or web changes. As we go through the slides, we'll dig into more detail in regards to what those changes are. Thank you. So this came out of the proposition session. Councils would often be very self-sufficient when it comes to integrations or flat files such as import export. One council mentions that they have the SQL skills in-house, which comes at no extra costs. However, it comes to, when it comes to more technical bits or where the contract boundary stops in terms of services and upgrades, they will need to rely on the supplier to make those changes. Some of these includes configurations to the ATP and AVR, as well as whitelisting and integrations from other third-party systems or adding a new service. Councils mentioned that changes to the AVR was where they actually tended to run into problems and extra costs. So from the survey, we wanted to understand, okay, so how much, what's the estimated value of how much is spent in regards to changes and integrations? So again, here we had mixed responses. This could be dependent on council size, team capability. When we received these results, we wanted to find out whether these were internal costs or supplier costs. So again, we wanted to flesh this out in regards to the proposition session that we had with users. So when we did that, we found that councils often have limited access to the changes, to access changes such as the web, and as a result are charged thousands of pounds from the supplier. So councils were seen to make changes around 3 to 4 times a year. So you can imagine how expensive it gets when you are having to make multiple changes, especially when you're going for transformational change. One council mentioned that he would be keen to keep the money within the public sector, which is a positive response in regards to our IMS position. So in regards to staff time, we wanted to ask, okay, how much time do you spend? Is it always? Is it sometimes? Is it rarely? And we found that from the survey, councils sometimes spend time doing integrations and changes, and we fleshed that out in the proposition session. So we wanted to understand how much effort and time is devoted to the IMS changes. And here we had mixed responses. So from 5 hours per year to 50 hours per year. So this didn't really give us much insight into how much effort and time was devoted. So again, this is something that we wanted to flesh out in the proposition. Again, these are some assumptions that is dependent on council, internal capability, and whether this is the responsibility of the supplier. So to flesh the previous slide out in the proposition, we asked questions around time and effort, and it was found that internal capability was influenced by time spent on integrations, changes, and configurations. We had councils mention that they spend around half a day doing integrations, and another council actually mentioned doing the flat file that took nearly a day to do. So councils often spend time doing workarounds in order to avoid the costs of going to the supplier to make changes. So this basically shows us, that councils are actually doing workarounds and they are trying to avoid those thousands of pounds that they are charged by suppliers, and trying to do those things internally before they go further. Next slide. So we after we proposed the proposition to them, we received a positive response from the IMS proposition, with council stating that they'll be looking to tender within the next year or so, and would look forward to putting money back into the public sector, with others stating that they found this really helpful and useful, and that the IMS proposition was really good, and that they will look to use it. So that was very positive from the council side.
Thank you, Sam. That's brilliant. I think it's I'm up on service governance. Richard, if you carry on driving, because I've only got the one slide for this bit, if you could go to that slide, that'd be great. Oh, I've only just entered that slide in 2 minutes before we started the show and tell. Maybe I'll share my screen. Give me a moment, and then I'll present a view, and then I will share my screen so that we can get that out. Okay, share my screen and share. Which screen am I sharing? I can never tell which of the screens it is. That one there, I think. Nope. Is that right? That looks good. So the question of governance is one that we've played around with, and we've had on our list since the beginning of the project. It's effectively, how do we allow and encourage councils and other providers to make changes to adapt the platform. So we want to balance the ability for adaptation and configuration and self-empowered use of this platform with issues such as security, which we know are very important when hosted by us as the first provider of it, but then potentially with other providers. So during the sprint, we had some conversations and put together a document which lays out the detail of different mechanisms for extension which need some kind of control or management on them. And they vary widely depending on what those mechanisms are. The first one is the provision of data access, either through APIs. Now, we've always had APIs on the product so that other tools or other bits of software can access certain elements and certain entities within the system, so that accounts can be uploaded, invoices can be, or payments can be, remittances can be provided. So access to those internal entities is important. As well as that, we've kind of, during the exploration of the infrastructure and the platform as a whole, we've also identified that we need to provide access to the data. We know that the part of the proposition is to provide some data reporting tools. So we're looking at AWS QuickSight, but on top of that, we suspect and we believe that councils do value being able to see their own databases, to see the databases which contain their data. I need to say that they can do other things. They can integrate into their own data warehouses, their own data analysis tools. They can bring it to Power BI or SSRS effectively and integrate the data. And it's very important. And therefore, we had to think about how that would be done, without impacting on the robustness, the availability, and the security of the platform itself. Luckily, because we're talking about a cloud platform, then that becomes easier because we have the ability to scale and cope with bursts of demand. Shareable configurations. So when we get to the interface, to get to the prototypes, we talk about the configuration of certain bits of it. We know from all the way through the project, including the discovery, how important it is that councils are able to configure their own imports, exports, those kind of things. Being able to make those shareable, although maybe not in the first iteration of the product, is something which will enable some of the things that we want out of the product, which is that the councils can form communities of shared usage. So somebody can build an interface to a certain type of file and provide it for all other councils. Again, so this cost-saving thing through sharing. Sometimes we recognize that sometimes the configuration of imports, exports, and data processing rules, etc., may go beyond the capabilities that you can do by using an interface, dragging and dropping. There are instances we have seen where the rules are quite complex. We want to provide mechanisms where code can be used to do those. That represents a specific problem when making the system secure. So we are looking at a plugin mechanism and having a constrained plugin mechanism which gives code limited access to the rest of the system. Now, it may be that the code extensions need to go through a different acceptance route if the council is on a shared or SaaS platform, do as if they take the self-hosted option. or the open source option, where they get to run whatever code they like on their servers. Those code extensions are one element of having a good software architecture, principles for software architecture, so that people who are developing code or in fact even changing the core code through the open source mechanism have a good idea of how to do things, and things are done consistently, so that we don't get into a mess where code is directly accessing databases when there is a mechanism which is preferred, which adds on extra value to accessing a database directly through frameworks and libraries, and just consistent ways of writing the code. All of that stuff is the software architectural principles are great for when you want more people to contribute to the core code, but it needs more than that. It really needs a community management of that open source code. That the best open source platforms and tools always have somebody who is encouraging, guiding, rallying, evangelizing about the use of the code, as well as ensuring that people get the right level of encouragement and feedback into doing things the right way and sharing in the right way. So those are the separate ways in which we feel that we need to make sure that changes to the platform and code is managed and governed. That's my slide for that bit, Dan. So I'll hand over to, I think it's Glenn next.
It is me next. So, Saw, you okay to carry on driving, or do you want to switch back to Richard? Or?
Let's switch back to Richard, because he knows what he's doing.
Okay, infrastructure and costs. So yeah, hi everybody. My name's Glenn Conroy and I'm from Dorset Council. However, tonight I am going to be Tony Evans from Huntingdon, because this is all of his hard work. So I just hope I can do it justice. Apologies if I don't, Tony, in advance. So the first slide is a simplified model of how we've looked at this systems architecture, and just moving left to right, we're showing basically a basic plan of how we want to try and build this thing. So essentially, customers will be initiating their payment either directly via an automated telephone service, or by chip and pin, or maybe indirectly via an assisted method, somebody being on the phone or what have you. That payment channel will then interact with the IMS, whether that be, for instance, something like gov.uk Pay, where that might be an API call, or it might be an end of day file that that is then utilized. And then the IMS will interact with the finance systems and any line of business delivery systems as well. So basically, essentially telling the finance system that these payments have been received, and also telling the delivery system, line of business system, that payment have been received, so it can facilitate the delivery of that service, and also any reconciliation that may want to happen. So looking at the next slide, it goes into a lot more detail. So we've been talking about this in quite a lot of depth, and you can see there's quite a detailed picture there. But some of the things that we've incorporated are things like the, as we've mentioned a few times, the file import and export operations, and how those files are stored. Especially with the extra complexity of this being based in the cloud. So we're trying to avoid that on-premise overhead. We've included things like the AWS QuickSight, so for reporting needs. So it doesn't necessarily mean you need the tools at hand on site. This enables you to front up dashboards and reporting on the data. The actual facilitating of logging and the storage of the logs, and then also user security modules and the authentication as well. So there's a lot in there. We are still in discussion around this, so this is not a finalized thing. A lot of it still needs to be proven, and there's still discussions around what may or may not sit behind the council's perimeter as well. So we've talked about things like files moving in and out with some sort of scheduling, or some sort of notification facility as well. So there's a lot still to be proven and discussed and decided. So next slide shows that we've been looking at the pricing around this as well. So this is again indicative of what we've found and what we've seen. So again, we need to go through and prove that this is the case, but we've seen that the summary being the infrastructure costs are of around £4,000. But what we need to do is then look at the costs on top of that around the support and maintenance of the application, and therefore what this is actually going to cost councils should they be looking to implement this. So hopefully I've done that justice, Tony, but pretty much a whistle-stop tour of what we've been discussing. There's obviously a lot of work that's gone into this so far, but still a lot of work to do to prove what we've the hypotheses we've come up with and the theories that we've come up with. But yes, back to Richard or Dan.
Actually, I think it's me to introduce Dan. So to talk about what prototypes we've been working on. We knew we needed to produce some prototypes to prove or test some of the things that we thought we understood in discovery. When we started digging into some of these, there really was some uncertainty about whether we really understood what the need was. And so we have come up with some prototypes which hopefully we feel will resolve some of that uncertainty. The first of which was around the need that we found in discovery for council finance teams to have greater control over the configuration of the platform. So it's going back to this file import export thing, which we keep talking about. And understanding, it was expressed during discovery that councils wanted better control over that. They wanted it to be able to happen faster and easier. That was clear. That was expressed as them being able to do it. When we started looking at what was involved in setting up a file import, a new file import mechanism, the complexity of the problem made us worried that actually providing the finance team with an interface may not be the right solution because it required certain complexity. So we started thinking about how do we find out whether they wanted this to happen easier or whether they wanted them to be able to do it. The thing we thought would, the choices that the finance team would have would be they do it themselves and understand the complexity of in file importing, or they hand it to a local team, i.e. their internal IT team. Before that was in preference to asking their supplier, and that either of those options could make it faster. We wanted to find out whether they think that as a finance team they would be able to define an import, or whether they would go to their IT team, and therefore whether their IT team would feel comfortable in doing it. So we have an example flow of when this is needed, which I'm going to queue up, and then Dan's going to take us through the screens that he's going to show, which show the complexity of how that needs to be defined. So the scenario is that a council takes on a new collection agent, somebody who collects money on their behalf. For example, let's say that they are a bailiff, a new bailiff company. It's not uncommon for that to happen without the finance team being told about it, and the first time they find out that they're getting new remittances, new notification of money coming in when it first happens. So it couldn't need to happen quickly. A new bailiff comes up, is signed up, they start collecting money, they then send the finance team or the income management team a new file, Excel file, CSV file, of all the things, all the money they've collected and which accounts that money applies to. That's the first time that the income management team have seen it. They've now got to set up how to import that. And Dan's prototypes will should. If Dan, can you grab the screen and show
Sure.
those prototypes and talk us through the steps that somebody would then need to do to set up that import.
Cool. Right. So I'm hoping you can all see my screen now with a sign-in screen. Yeah, cool. Right. So I've been provided an import file. So say this is just a fixed width text file from the new collection agent. So I want to go into the income management system and configure that import rule. So if I sign into the system and go into the settings section, what I'll see first of all is a list of all the existing imports and exports that are in the system. I can see that the file I want to import isn't present there, so I want to actually add that and create that as a new entry in this import list. So if I hit create new, the first thing I would do is give it a name. So in this case, because it's a bailiffs import, I can type in bailiffs there and continue on. The next thing it needs is a copy of the file, so either a sample which follows the same format or the actual first import to provide the system so we can start defining all the rules around it. So if I upload the file, the next thing it'll do is recognize that it's a fixed width file import. So if it was a CSV, this screen may be slightly different. If it was a different file format, like an Excel, again, it might be different. But for fixed width files, there's a few things we're interested in: what row we're going to start at, how long the line length should be, do I skip empty rows or should they cause an error? And once I've defined those initial parsing rules for the file, I can continue on. And what IMS will try and do is find the white space, if there is any, in the fixed width file and put in some markers, because each area in this file on the rows is a different piece of data. And the first thing we've got to do when configuring an import rule is to find out what we're working with and tell IMS what those bits of information represent. And there's two ways you could do this on this screen. So you could drag the handles around and determine, all right, this is the name, this is the date, this part is the amount, and sort of configure them that way. Or you can just type in where the start point is in the fixed width file and how long that goes through, and add more in manually using this button. Then you just name the bits of information, so you can give these all a name just to help you work with them on the next screen. You can handle different types of dates and configure the date formats. You can determine whether it's a number, and if it's text that you've defined, do you want to trim all the white space around it? So you can see for the names on there, there's a lot of white space after them before the date. If you tick that trim option, it just get rid of all that for you. What you can do then is when you progress on, the next screen is where you map all that information that you've defined against transaction fields. So this is the part where you're saying, all right, these are this is everything we need to be able to create a transaction in IMS, and we're going to map all these bits of information to fields we defined earlier. In this case, it's recognized that field 4 was the only date, so it's defaulted field 4 to the transaction date for you. But you could go through these and say, all right, well, this field corresponded to the account reference, this field corresponded to the amount. We know every single thing that comes in on this file is a particular fund, so we can set that manually on the right-hand side after the OR. So you get flexibility. Are you grabbing this from the file, or is this something that's always going to be the same? For some things like narrative, you might want to combine things. So if you wanted to, say, grab the customer's name and their address if it was in the file, for example, you could hit the formulas button and do some sort of Excel style concatenation to build the piece of text you need to put into that narrative. If you're a power user as well, you could type the sort of concat function inside there, similar to Excel. So you've got flexibility. It doesn't just have to be something you've defined in the import. You can provide it at this point, or you can merge and do some operations on fields to get them to be how you'd need them to be. If you then progress again, we have the option to add some extra validation. So if we don't just want to validate that the file parses based on the rules we defined earlier, we can say, all right, well, we want to look at bits of content in this file to make sure it's the right file that's been given to us. So it's not uncommon for these fixed width text files to have sort of headers and footers in them that have sort of special characters that determine and mark the areas of the body data. And we might just want to check that they're in there. So in this case, we could select the first record must contain the marker for the start of the file, the last record must contain the marker for the end of the file, or we could check that a particular field must have this value because it's checking that row is valid. So you can define these rules and add multiple rules in just to check, all right, we know we can parse this file, but Is the content in it valid? Has something gone wrong? Do we need to sort of reject it or flag that up to a user? And then if we continue on, what you would get is a preview of the import for the first time. So it's telling us that file processing worked all right. Everything in the file was within those line lengths. We recognize everything. We could turn everything into a transaction. And secondly, all the validation rules we defined have passed. So we know we've got that header record in. We know we've got that footer record in. And then just in case, we can feed back to the user, you should have 3 transactions in this document, and this is how much they should total. So if you know that's not the case, if you know you've been paid extra, you can say, all right, well, what's wrong with my rule? You know, maybe the handle for the amount is just in slightly the wrong place, and you can go back and tweak that until you do get a pass and the result you want. So once you're happy with that, you can continue on, and you can choose to set up a schedule. So you can say, all right, I want to run this import every minute at this time or every day at this time, and set up some advanced scheduling rules. Or you could set it to trigger on file upload. So you could say, when I SFTP this file up into the import store, run it straight away, rather than put it up there and it'll run on a schedule. Or alternatively as well, you can say, don't schedule anything. If I need to run this file, I'll come into the system just the same way we have on here and do a manual import each time. So it might be something that's like a bit more ad hoc. You don't want to run it on a schedule all the time. And then if you continue, if you had selected either of the first 2 options there, so not running it manually, it would ask you for a file name pattern. So it's just a way of saying, if I see a file that matches this pattern, then I'm going to try and run it through this import. So that would be defined, and then your import would be created. If you were to then go back to the import export screen, that would show in this list. So you would see the new bailiff import in this list, that it had never actually been run, but it has all been defined. And to give you some additional context, for some of these that have been running, if you were to hit view, you can see where it's coming from, when it's scheduled, and see previous executions. How many rows did it process? Did it work or not? If you had any errors, that could trigger an email alert to the users so they could come in and investigate and then actually get visibility of what the error was. So it looks like the file had some bad character in it that it couldn't process. But what can sometimes happen is the wrong file can be uploaded or files can be uploaded again. So you also get the option to undo. So you could come into a particular import and say, right, I know I've run this twice. I want to get rid of the second time. So it'll show you everything it's going to reverse, and you could confirm that as well. The next part of the system would be, let me just go back, the processing rules. So once you've defined your imports and you're getting those transactions into the system on a schedule or as and when you need to, you can define processing rules to say, all right, if we see transactions that match these criteria, we actually want to move them into different buckets. We want to move them to different places. And that would be done within processing rules. So if we walk through creating one of those, the first thing you would do is just describe it. What are we trying to automate? What are we trying to prevent manual intervention on? Which import process do we want to run it against? And then what are the criteria that we would want to match to say, yes, this rule should be firing? So you can chain these together and you could say, all right, well, if we see money coming in from this account or this file in the system, or the narrative contains these details, what we want to do on the next screen is change a field on it and automatically transfer that transaction somewhere else and change that transaction. And then when that was set up, that would automatically run on import as well for that job. So not only are you able to get the transactions into the system, you're able to make sure they end up in the right place and stop those manual interventions. And I think that's it for the prototypes thus far.
That's brilliant, Dan. Thank you very much. So want to emphasize that these prototypes, well, a couple of prototypes, the processing rules and imports are just 2 of the 4 that we're hoping to prototype. And they are specifically to allow us to test whether the complexity of this configuration is something that the finance team could do themselves, or whether we need to check whether these tools are more suited to an IT function and then a local IT team. So we are not sure about the best way to meet that need for better, faster, cheaper configuration, whether it's direct access or through an IT team. Thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to hand back to Richard to sum up.
Cool.
Richard, you're on mute.
Of course I am. I do that every time. So this is what we're going to look at during sprint 4. We're going to finalise the prototypes as Saul's just described, and we're going to finalise up the proposition document following all the research and things we've learned that Sam's described. And we're going to put together the final cost model for the future service based on that infrastructure that Glenn talked through and the costs that we've identified as part of that. And then ultimately sprint 4 is our consolidation and write-up sprint. So we'll start to pull everything together into the final set of documents that we'll submit back to MHCLG. It's going to be a fun 2 weeks. That is it for our show and tell. We are 3 minutes early, which is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Does anybody want to raise any questions? They will be recorded and published. So you can see the URL on the screen. That's where all of our show and tells and week notes, etc., are all published on our progress. So you can always go there. But I think all of you, looking at the list of participants there, all of you know where we are. So if there is anything you want to feedback on, we very, very much want to hear your reaction to what we presented here, as well as any questions that you've got around it. Thank you very much for attending.